started with today's episode, I would like to quickly read you our podcast disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and it is not to substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. You should always speak with your physician or other healthcare professionals before doing any fasting, changing your diet in any way, taking or adjusting any medications or supplements, or adopting any treatment plan for a health problem. The use of any other products or services purchased by you as a result of this podcast does not create a healthcare provider-patient relationship between you and any of the experts affiliated with this podcast. Any information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. All right, and now we'll get started with today's episode.
A warm welcome to everyone here in TFM Community and also our podcast listeners who will be able to listen to this Q&A with Dr. Fung in a few weeks after our community members get access to it first. This is a monthly Q&A with Dr. Fung as he answers questions submitted by our TFM community members. So, Dr. Fung, hi, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good to see you. We're getting more and more questions about children and insulin resistance. Of course, the parents should always check with their pediatrician, but could you speak on what type of diet a child could be on if they start showing signs of metabolic issues, especially if the mother had gestational diabetes while carrying them?
Yeah, so we are seeing a lot more type 2 diabetes in children. It used to be very, very rare, but now it's unfortunately not that uncommon. So it is a very important problem. Insulin resistance really is the same as hyperinsulinemia, which is basically too much insulin. And the idea is that if you have too much insulin acting all the time, then the body becomes resistant to it because it's just sort of what happens to it. So the main thing is, how are you going to reduce the sort of effect of the insulin? Remember, insulin is a normal hormone, but it tells the body to store fat. So therefore it can lead to weight gain and then type 2 diabetes down the line. So catching it early is very important. And it really comes down to the same things that we talk about here a lot, which is eating natural foods, eating unprocessed foods, staying away from junk foods, and a lot of the processed carbohydrates. You know, there's always this distinction between any carbohydrate versus refined carbohydrates. Refined carbohydrates just tend to spike the insulin and the glucose much more. So you can see this in any glycemic index chart. You can see that if you eat, say, sort of white bread, it's going to be much higher than eating, say, beans or something like that. So, you know, people sometimes push back and say, oh, not all carbs are bad. It's like, agree. There's definitely some people who can tolerate it and not, but you want to stick to sort of unrefined foods, cutting down the sugars and so on, because the insulin resistance is really not much different than, you know, it's the same process, whether it happens in children or whether it happens in adults. If it happens in children, you really want to just be much more vigilant. So eating unprocessed foods and then making sure that you do have an adequate period of fasting overnight, which is like a 12-hour sort of minimum, which means cutting out snacks and cutting out late night eating as much as possible, because you want to give your body a break from eating every so often. And that allows your insulin levels to fall, because if your insulin levels fall, then you can help restore some of that sensitivity. So that's the idea. So, you know, whether it's in children or whether it's in adults, it's the same sort of program of good foods and then having a period of basically letting your body just rest and not eat.
Yeah. Children often innately go back into low level of nutritional ketosis in the morning. I know I said that in one of my groups, and somebody piped up and said, yeah, her son always wanted to blow in the biosynths in the morning too, because mommy was, and he was always blowing ketones at low level. So that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This next person says, for someone who, and I'm kind of skating on medical advice here, but just skating at the close to the edge. For someone who has lost their sense of smell during COVID, but could smell again during a 5-day fast, would it be a good idea to keep at it, hopefully for a permanent restoration of their sense of smell?
So the thing about the sense of smell is that we don't know what causes the loss of smell with COVID. So that was very typical of COVID, but whether it's due to inflammation around the nerve of the nose, that's hard to say. So we don't know why. So if it worked, then that's great. And yeah, I think that it would be certainly reasonable to keep at it and try to do another one or do shorter fasts and see what happens with it. Because the thing about the 5-day fasting is that some people feel that it may help with a lot of the inflammation that happens in the body, because the inflammation is caused by your own immune cells that are overactive. When you put a stress on the body, such as fasting, your body is getting the signal that, hey, there's no nutrients coming in. I can't just be wasting all my energy doing all kinds of stuff, right? So some people feel that one of the benefits of longer fasting is to actually reduce a lot of that inflammation, because those overactive immune cells get basically culled, because your body's like, I can't afford to be attacking myself. I can't waste my energy on this. Let's get rid of these extra cells. And therefore, some of the extra inflammation may actually go down. So we have anecdotal stories of people who find that their thyroids get better, and so all kinds of things that you wouldn't have expected necessarily. And it may be related to that anti-inflammatory effect. So remember that when you do the longer fast, especially, your body goes into this sort of repair mode as opposed to a growth mode. And maybe that is what's doing it. Either way, the key is that if it's making you feel better, if you feel better with it, if you notice a difference, then yeah, I would do it again and see if you can get the same benefit. Why not? You always have to say, what do you have to lose? In this case, it's nothing. As long as you have a couple of extra pounds of body fat that you're able to lose, then there's no reason that you couldn't go for a longer fast. And then what do you have to gain? And it's like, well, what you have to gain here is something that actually cannot be delivered by any other medicines, restoring that sense of smell. So yeah, I'd say go ahead and give it. That's the way to approach it, not what a lot of doctors do is would say, oh, well, there's no evidence that it works, so don't do it. It's like, well, there's no evidence that it doesn't work either, so you should do it. The proper way to look at it is sort of, what's your risks of doing it? What's your benefits of doing it? And remember, everybody's different. Just because if I do it, it may work for me. And if somebody else does it, it may not work for them. That doesn't mean anything. Everybody's different. So it doesn't mean that the treatment is necessarily good or bad. You have to see what the treatment is for yourself. And that's the key.
Thank you. All right. This person says, I can't quite make myself fast more than 24 hours. In the last 3 months, I started eating once a day, mostly every day, 17 to 24 hours fasting in between. And my question is, would I be able to completely reverse my diabetes if I stuck to this way of eating? I don't seem to be able to make myself do this. Have you seen this in your practice?
Yeah, so you don't have to fast longer than that for reversing type 2 diabetes, but then you have to be much more vigilant in terms of carbohydrates and the amount you're eating and so on. So people who eat, for example, a ketogenic diet, they don't necessarily fast for a long time, but on the other hand, they're very strict about cutting out all carbohydrates. So, you can get there from different ways. So if the fasting really doesn't work for you, then there are other ways to do it. But it means you have to be a bit more strict on the foods that you're eating, and then maybe checking your blood sugars and seeing which foods spike you and so on. So yeah, fasting is not the only way. It's a tool, right? And if for some people it works very well, some people do these longer fasts and have no problems with it, and then they get the benefits of it. So other people find it very, very difficult, in which case they have to look for other ways to get the same results. In the end, it's whether you want to be very strict on the types of food you're eating, but eat more frequently, that'll work. But for some people, the fasting works better, because then they don't have to think about it. They just do the fasting, and then they are less strict on the foods that they eat, and they can still get to the same place. So that's the decision you have to make for yourself. Because again, everybody's different. So some people will do one and some people will do the other. And it doesn't mean that one person's right and one person's wrong. It just means that you have to find what works for you. The problem is that if neither work for you, then you really have to think about how are you going to be able to make one of these ways work to reverse that diabetes, because if you do have diabetes, it can cause a lot of damage to the organs and so on.
I had one lady, she was in her mid 70s and she did not want to fast. She did like maybe a couple of 24s and she didn't like them. So she just stuck to TRE, low carb, no processed carbs, that kind of thing. And it took her 8 months, but she got off both of her medications and her insulin. I was very surprised. It took her 8 months, but she got there. So, stuck with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just goes to show you that everybody's very individual. When we started, of course, with Megan and I, nobody was using fasting. And that was the point, that you're not using a tool that can potentially help. That's why it's important to explore that as a way. You don't have to use it because some people don't like it. And if you don't like it, then if you don't like it, you'll never stick to it. So there's no point. On the other hand, some people try it and some people, have a tough time at first, but then get used to it and then are able to do it, or they get help with it and then they can get through it. So there's lots of different ways. I mean, we use in the fasting method, the fat fasting, for example, right? That's not a fast. It's just something that is sort of very highly ketogenic and a little bit monotonous, right? And it delivers a lot of the benefits. There's other things like the fasting mimicking diet, which is, again, not a real fast. There's the 5-2, which is the eating 500 calories on your fasting day. So there's all these variations that play in between the foods that you're eating and the fasting that you're doing. You can change them in sort of infinite variety of ways. And one of them may resonate with people that, hey, maybe the fat fasting really works for somebody, right? I mean, we've had a lot of success with it where people just go on a very highly ketogenic diet, and then that sort of transitions them into being able to fast. So it changes too.
Dr. Fung, in one of your videos, you suggested eating your protein and fat 10 minutes before eating carbs. How many grams of protein or fat are required?
I think the answer is really until you're full. I'm not a huge fan of counting grams and counting calories and so on, because really the foods that you eat will dictate how much you eat, right? People always worry so much about how much they're eating. But really, it's like if you're eating the right foods and you're listening to yourself, right? I'm not talking about mindless eating and emotional eating and so on. But if you listen to your body, they will tell you how much you need to eat, because these natural foods have natural satiety hormones. So really, until you're full. And the advantage of that, and this is the way they did it in the study, was that you eat your vegetables and protein. So you have your salads and your chicken and beef or whatever that you're eating, and then you have your carbs later. It does two things. One is that for the amount of carbohydrate that you take, it will have much less of an insulin effect. And probably it's because it gets absorbed slower. So remember, when you're eating, say you eat the bread, how they in restaurants, they give you the bread at the beginning, right? So if you eat the bread right off the bat, you get all that carbohydrate. It's very pure carbohydrate, like 100% carbohydrate, the bread. And there's nothing else in your stomach. So basically, your stomach moves it along, and therefore you get pure carbohydrate coming down. You spike your sugar. If you have a lot of salad and vegetables and steak and hamburger or whatever that's just in the stomach, and then you take your bread 10 minutes later, well, it's going to get mixed in, because that's what the stomach does. You got all this stuff, it's going to mix in, so you're going to shoot it down. In the small intestines, you're going to have a mix of stuff. So therefore, you're not getting like a big lump of pure carbohydrate. You're getting a bunch of vegetable. You're getting, so then the absorption is slower, which means that your body can handle it much better. And we know that it's not simply the total amount of carbohydrate, but the way it gets absorbed. The fast absorbing has much worse effect on you. So eating it first does two good things. So for the amount of carbohydrate, you get much less insulin effect, and you're going to eat less carbohydrate overall. Because again, if you're full already and you want to eat until you're full, then you're not going to eat so much bread. Like if you eat bread and then your meal, or your meal and then bread, obviously you're going to eat less of the bread at the second one because you're full already. So it does sort of two good things at the same time, not necessarily totally cutting out the carbohydrate in your meal if you don't want to feel that you're depriving yourself all the time.
Real food, real signals, fake food, fake signals, right?
Yeah, that's the whole problem with ultra processed foods, and people talk about it more now. The thing is that it's funny to watch because everybody knows that ultra processed foods are really bad for you. Like anybody who has like a brain says, okay, it's really bad for you. But then you get all these dietitians and scientists and doctors who are like, well, the carbs are this and proteins are this and fats are this and that's the same. So therefore it doesn't make any difference. And like, what are you talking about? The structure of the food, how it's presented, the chemicals that are in the food, they all make a big difference. Like, I don't know why you'd pretend that they don't make a difference, but people do, right? You see this, there's a big hubbub a month ago on Time magazine where the headline said, what if ultra processed foods aren't that bad for you? Right? It's like, okay, well, that's just ridiculous, right? Like the actual thought of somebody trying to say that it's not bad is sort of, it's just so they must have been so brainwashed into this sort of nutritionism, which is trying to pigeonhole foods by certain categories. Like it's 100 calories, therefore 100 calories of cookies are the same as 100 calories of broccoli. It's like, okay, they're nothing alike. Or trying to say that 100 grams of carbs is the same as another 100 grams of carbs. No, if you eat white bread versus beans, the same 100 grams of carbs, they're completely different because they're digested differently. Or if you say, okay, you have a food, which is a natural food, and a food which is completely chemically altered with a lot of additives. And yes, these chemical additives have no calories, but it doesn't mean that they don't have any effect on you. And it's like, I don't know why, but people get so into this, oh, let's just break it down. It's called reductionism, where you kind of reduce a food to its carbs or calories or this or that, when in fact, there's actually so many different ways that it makes a difference. And we know this. We have tons of studies that show this. If you take instant oatmeal versus steel cut oatmeals, there's a massive difference in the way that the body handles it. There's much more insulin effect on the instant oatmeals, and it's because they shred it into tiny little things, and that makes a difference in terms of digestion, which makes a difference in terms of hormone release, and the hormone release makes a difference in terms of how your body is going to respond. But people say, well, oats are oats. Calories are calories, carbs are carbs. So the same food, the same calories, the same carbohydrates, but the way you make it, whether you grind it into a fine dust or not, makes a big difference. So why would you pretend that it doesn't? People do, right? Scientists like to do this. They like to, especially in the newspaper, they like to choose one thing, whether it's calories or carbs or whatever. And it's like, it's not. It's all of it together. Right. So the order of the food makes a difference too. It actually can make a very big difference. There's tons of studies that show that eating the carbs at the end of the meal makes it much less insulin effect. So if you're trying to look at weight gain or diabetes, then that's much preferable.
And you have a Medium article on that, and you also have a YouTube article on that, on food order, carb order.
Yeah.
A good resource for everyone if you go looking for it. So speaking of protein, could Dr. Fung please discuss carnivore as an elimination diet? And if you think it's a good idea as an elimination diet, what about a long-term diet?
Carnivore is a type of elimination diet. I mean, it eliminates all vegetables basically, which gets rid of all carbs. There are a couple of key benefits in that. So people who are very carb addicted, for example, because we know that highly refined carbs can spike dopamine and all that sort of stuff. So it's going to be a very highly carbohydrate restricted diet. So ketogenic, but even stricter than ketogenic, really. It also gets rid of all the seed oils because if you're eating carnivore, you're generally avoiding a lot of seed oils as well, which some people feel is very important. And then the other thing is certain people don't react well to plants, so nightshades and all these other some plant foods. They talk about it in the Plant Paradox. This is a book by Dr. Gundry. But some of these foods may be kind of inflammatory because remember, plants are not growing up to be our food. They're growing up and have defense mechanisms. So some people may react to them. So you see this, for example, in gluten sensitivity, but more than that, there's people who are sensitive to wheat in particular, and it's actually the wheat agglutinin protein as opposed to the gluten. That's the problem. So there's different proteins in certain plants that some people may react to very badly. They may develop leaky gut and all this other stuff. So for those people, they are helped quite a bit. So it is a type of elimination diet. I think it's actually a perfectly reasonable diet if you want to, but as any kind of elimination diet, it's actually not easy to follow because the variety of foods that you eat is very low. And so therefore, if you can stick to it, then good on you. It's helping, then good on you. I have no problems with it. It just tends to be much more difficult than most because it is very, very highly restrictive. And most people do enjoy certain plant foods, right? So it's often difficult to do that on a long-term basis. So it's not that I have any problem if people want to take it long-term. It's just that it's not the easiest diet to follow in the long term, just because of that. For long-term diets, what we talk about, mostly cutting out processed foods, right? I think you get a long way there by cutting out processed foods and making sure you're not eating all the time, right? You want to set aside a period of time that you're eating and set aside a period of time that you're not eating. And then when you eat, you want to eat till you're full, but eat real foods, right? So not Cheetos, but eat chicken and vegetables and that kind of.
One of the ingredients on Cheetos is it says cheese-like substance. What does that mean, Dr. Fung? Cheese-like substance. What is that substance? It's like, what?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's actually a lot if you actually start to look at it, and even stuff you don't think is too bad. Because if you look at, like, I was looking at sour cream one of the days, and there was two, right? One was just cream and bacteria, and that's the one I tried to buy, but actually it was very difficult. Only one out of like 5 supermarkets near me sold that. The other one has like modified cornstarch and all this other stuff. I'm like, what are you modifying with the cornstarch? Like, I know what cornstarch is. That's not that good for you. And how are you modifying this, right? It's like, please, like, why are you putting it in, right? There's all this stuff that gets thrown in there. And I guess we're so used to it these days that we don't think about it, but it's like, there's a lot of stuff that when you start reading labels, that's like, oh, it's modified or hydrolyzed or this or that. And it's like, whoa, what are you doing to this ingredient, which already is pretty iffy, right? So yeah, and the funny part is that sour cream example was like the sour cream that was just cream was only like $1 more, but nobody sold it. And that was the real problem. I'm like, so I have to go out of my way to get this. So, it's the same with any of these yogurts and stuff. So there's yogurts, which is like a sort of just yogurt. And that usually is a bit more, but then you get this stuff and there's all this modified guar gum and all this stuff in there. And it's like, I don't know what that's doing to me, but it's probably not a good idea. So cutting them out is generally a good idea. And, you don't have to eliminate everything like a carnivore diet does, but if you like it, certainly go ahead.
Sort of like, do you want to run around town in a beat up jalopy? Or do you want to ride around in a Lexus or a Mercedes or a Ferrari?
Yeah.
What do you want to burn here? So yeah, looking at that as fuel. Yeah. This person says, I have a CGM and my blood glucose goes up after the first meal. It plateaus. Then I eat the second meal and it goes even higher, and it doesn't return to the original level until overnight when I wake up in the morning. Does this mean that my meals are too close together, or what? That I'm not giving it enough time to come back down between meals?
Yeah, probably. And if it's still staying high, then again, it's probably a good idea to either skip it or take a lot less. This is where the CGMs are great information because obviously everybody's different. So somebody else will eat the exact same foods at the exact same times and be completely fine. And that's the whole point. This is personalized medicine. Like I see sometimes online people saying, oh, you shouldn't use a CGM and it's this and that. I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about because it's just information. We're just trying to get information because everybody's different. We're in an age where it is possible to do personalized medicine because of devices like this. So this is a great example because you see the information that second meal is probably too much because the sugars are going up and not coming down, right? That's not normal. So you either have to skip that other meal or you have to just take a very, very light meal because even if you eat a little bit, it's going to push your sugars way up. And your body doesn't need that energy. because your sugars are up. If it needs energy, it's going to burn some of that sugar. So yes, that's exactly the right information. And I think we should acknowledge this is very useful information for people because you could not tell. I couldn't tell from looking at you or the next person or the next person who's going to react like that. You simply can't. You need to measure it. Otherwise, you don't know. And if you don't know, you can't make the adjustments. But if you know, then you can make the adjustments and then say, okay, so now what I'm going to do is watch that second meal. Or maybe I need to be like super low carb on the second meal. So maybe you eat less, or maybe you change what you eat, or whatever it is. And then you check, did it make a difference? If it did, then that's probably a good thing.
So this comes to the next question. Is it important while I'm doing this, if I'm type 2 diabetic, to have a ketone monitor or a CGM? Are blood ketone monitors more accurate than what the information it would give me?
The CGMs are useful because the glucose fluctuates a lot, like minute to minute, actually second to second, probably. So the point of a CGM is that you can see what's happening all the time. Ketone measurements, generally you can. They have the breath ones, which you can use, but they're a little bit less accurate and they're not continuous. They're not like, you put it in and you can monitor it all the time. You have to still blow in it and so on. So the ketones are different. You don't have to do it, but on the other hand, if you are type 2 diabetic, I think it gives you a whole lot of useful information because, again, there's differences in the way people react to foods. So if you have person A eat one food and person B eat the same food, there can be very different reactions to that same food. We take an average. So the glycemic index takes like 100 people and you take an average and say, on average, bread is this, right? But that doesn't tell you what happens to you. It's just information. It's just like personalizing what you can eat and what you can't eat. Because then if you know that that bread is actually not bad, say you take a slice of rye bread or sourdough bread and you find, hey, the reaction's not bad at all, well, then you don't necessarily need to cut it out, especially if you enjoy it, right? Then it's like, hey, this is actually not that bad. So it gives you great information. And ketones are not continuous. There's no continuous ketone monitor as far as I know. And it also gives a little bit different information. Ketones tells you that you're into the sort of fat burning mode because when you're metabolizing fat. So that's where the ketogenic diet, if you check that you're maintaining ketosis, then you know you're sort of always in the fat burning mode as opposed to the sugar burning mode. So that's useful. But I don't think there's a continuous one the same way. If they had one, then it might be useful. But the CGMs, they give you different information. But the continuous nature of the CGM makes it more useful than the ketone monitors in general.
And one person sent in a question about, it seems to me that just getting one blood test to determine if you're pre-diabetic or not could be very misleading given the variability. So I definitely would agree with that. A lot of people get that fasting blood sugar level as opposed to looking at the hemoglobin A1C or looking at what you're doing over time, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So overtime is actually what's the most important. And that's where I actually stopped doing the fasting glucose because it's just too variable. And I don't see that it gives you any better information than doing an A1C. Some people actually have a very high A1C to begin with, and other people are very low. So it's always hard to tell. I have some people who are quite overweight, they have metabolic syndrome, but then their A1Cs are like 5.4, and they've always been that. And then I have these little old Chinese people who are like, clearly not overweight. They're actually quite skinny, and their A1Cs are like 6.2. But then you look back and it's like, okay, well, it's always been like that. So is that bad? Is that not bad? According to sort of conventional medicine, 6.2, that's bad. But it's like, I don't know that that's actually bad, because I followed them and they're like 88 years old sort of thing, right? And it's like, okay, well, they've obviously done well enough with their A1C of 6.2, 6.4. And it's been like that for like 30 years sort of thing, right? So it's interesting but I think that, again, like a lot of things in medicine, it's not the actual number it's not the only thing that's important, but it's that trend over time. Because if you're pretty healthy with an A1C of 6.2 and you maintain that, there's a good chance you'll just stay healthy. So the absolute number is only part of it, but I think the stability over time is what's important.
This person asked, why and how do non-caloric, sugar-free natural sweeteners such as Atevia and Truvia. Is that how you say it? I'm not sure. I don't buy them, so I don't know. Raise insulin.
Oh, because a lot of things can raise insulin. So remember, insulin is released when your body anticipates food. So there's something called also the cephalic response, which is that when you see food, your insulin will start to go up in anticipation that you're going to be eating the food. So, you start salivating, the insulin starts to go up. You haven't even eaten anything yet. Your insulin actually has already started to go up. It's the same thing with these non-caloric sweeteners. So it activates the same thing. You can measure these in several ways. You can measure the actual amount of insulin rise. So the older ones, the aspartames, were actually much worse. They actually spike the insulin more. The newer ones tend not to have so much, but then it depends on the way you look at it. So if you measure it just the total amount of insulin, there's a relatively small rise in it. But if you look at the rise in insulin compared to the rise in blood glucose, because remember, your insulin's supposed to go up with your blood glucose. Because you're not eating anything, your blood glucose doesn't go up, but your insulin goes up, which is, again, that's setting up a bad situation, because if you're pulling in your glucose, you may become a little bit hypoglycemic, which is then going to stimulate appetite. It's going to make you want to eat and so on, which is the big thing, because it's not the calories and all that that's really important. It's like, people always say, oh, it's about calories in, calories out. It's like, no. Calories in, calories out is sort of the end result. What is it that's driving you to eat more calories in over calories out? That's what's really important. And it's the hunger, right? So it's like, it's so stupid, I think, honestly, these calories people that think that, we're like a machine or something like that. It's the reason why, like, if you say you're overeating calories and that's what's causing you to gain weight, technically it's true. But why are you doing it? Is it because you have no willpower? Is it because you want to gain weight? No, obviously not. You're eating more because you're hungry. And what is it that's driving your hunger? Well, maybe it's the sweetness and the hypoglycemia. Your body is expecting to eat, but you're not giving it anything to eat. So it really wants to go out and get something. Or maybe your blood glucose, because your insulin's going up, but your glucose isn't, it's starting to come down. So it's all this sort of interplay of trying to understand what's driving the hunger.
Yeah.
So people who focus in on the calories in, calories out are so misguided because they're always focused on the wrong thing. It's sort of like if you're alcoholic, you say, well, that's easy. It's just alcohol in minus alcohol out. Just drink less alcohol. It's like, that's the stupidest answer anybody could give. Or if you're addicted to heroin or cocaine, just take less cocaine. That'll solve your cocaine problem. Like, well, obviously, but it's really stupid. You need to look at what is it that's driving that alcohol in greater than alcohol out? Oh, is it depression? Is it PTSD? Same thing. What is it that's driving the calories in greater than calories out? Is it the hunger? Okay, now we can work with something. What's driving your hunger? Is it ultra-processed foods? Because we know that these foods are processed so that you don't get full, so you go and buy more. Is it the frequency of eating? Is it the food order? Is it you're not eating enough bulky foods? Because we know that if you have very bulky foods, it activates stretch receptors in the stomach. Then you can actually say, okay, well, this is the problem, that you're eating ultra-processed foods, which is making you hungry, including sweeteners, that is making you hungry, which is driving you to eat calories in more greater than calories out, which is driving the weight gain. Now you actually have a plan to deal with how to lose weight. Don't eat ultra-processed foods. Not, oh, only eat 500 calories of ultra-processed foods because 500 calories of Cheetos is the same as 500 calories of eggs. No, they're nothing the same. When you eat those Cheetos, you want to eat more Cheetos. That's the whole point. You eat the 500 calories of Cheetos, you want to eat another 500 calories of Cheetos. You eat 500 calories of eggs, you really don't want to eat more eggs because you're full. Like, when was the last time you ate 3 eggs and thought, wow, I could really go for another 3 eggs? Like, not that common, because you're less hungry than you were than before. Whereas the Cheetos, they say you eat Cheetos and drink Diet Pepsi. Okay, it's all ultra processed. You're going to get the 500 calories of Cheetos and Diet Pepsi, then you're going to want more. And that's what's driving calories in, calories out. Not that calories in is greater than calories out. It's what's behind that. And that's what is always so funny about this whole calories argument, is that how stupid it really is. It's like, we're not arguing the same thing. They think we're arguing that it doesn't matter. And in a sense, it doesn't matter. Just like, it's not the alcohol that matters in alcoholism necessarily. It's what's behind the alcohol in greater than alcohol out. That's really important. And then people say, how can you say that alcohol isn't important? It all comes down to alcohol in minus alcohol out. Nobody says that. But if you apply the exact same logic to calories, people say, oh, very smart. Oh, you should be a professor. I was like, oh my God, like, do these people ever help anybody? Like, the whole thing is just very, very strange.
Did you know that aspartame, they changed the name on it recently to amino sweet?
Yeah.
I guess because it's got such a bad reputation, they just changed the name on it. So now so buyer beware.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's the same thing with sweeteners. It's like some people tolerate it fine, and I have no problem with that. But again, how many people have ever said to you or me, oh, I just switched to diet soda, lost 30 pounds. You think nobody's tried that before? It doesn't even make any sense why these people are defending sweeteners. We have studies. David Ludwig did a study where he put people on diet soda versus soda, and really no difference between the two, even though the diet soda had way less sugar. It was the same because it was the sweetness that drove you to eat more. That's the only way, because the sweetener itself does not have sugar and it doesn't drive the insulin to the same degree. It does drive it a little bit, but not to the same degree. So, you just have to use a little bit of common sense here. It's funny how as soon as you start talking about calories, everybody's like, oh, that's end of the story. It's just calories. No. The calories you eat for Cheetos is different than the calories that you eat. They're different calories. They have different effects.
Yeah. I had one client, she tracked her weight every day for decades and decades and decades. And when we were talking about this, she went back and looked when she started her Diet Pepsi habit. And she just looked at her graph, and that's when she spiked on her weight. And then she went off of it for she did some kind of other diet that was like the only one that worked for her. I think it was kind of a modified Atkins. She didn't do the Diet Pepsi, and she lost weight. And then when she started back on the Diet Pepsi, she went right back up, and she's like, you can see it.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And everybody is always about, oh, but there's no calories. Who cares? It doesn't matter. If that Diet Pepsi is driving your hunger, then it's going to drive you to eat more, which is going to drive weight gain. It's not the calories. It's what drove you to do that. You have to understand things at a deeper level. And that's why I always think it's so strange, these people who are all like, oh, yes, love diet soda. It's like, yes, because there's lots of people who drink diet soda and are fine. But there's also a lot of people who drink diet soda and are not fine because they eat more. And that's where personalizing it is very important.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fung. I really appreciate it, answering all our questions. And I will see you again next month.
Okay, take care.
All right, everybody, happy Healing or Rebuilding Day, whichever one you're doing. Bye-bye.